I never expected the most dangerous courtroom in the Atlantic to be the deck of a pirate ship. There were no marble columns, no judges in powdered wigs, no polished benches or royal seals hanging above the accused. Only weathered planks soaked with salt, a ring of armed men, and a captain standing silently while 12 members of his own crew decided whether he deserved to keep command or die before sunset. That man was not standing before the Royal Navy. He was standing before pirates. The image feels wrong because almost everything popular culture has taught us about pirate justice is backwards. We have been told that pirate ships were floating kingdoms of chaos, where the strongest man ruled with terror, where arguments ended with a pistol, and where discipline depended entirely on a captain's temper. The reality preserved in surviving pirate articles, Admiralty court records, and eyewitness accounts tells a far stranger story. The men history remembers as bloodthirsty outlaws often placed limits on their own power that many legal governments of the same age refused to accept. That contradiction is the heart of this story. The greatest naval empire on Earth trusted authority. Pirates trusted agreements. The Royal Navy allowed captains enormous power over their crews. A sailor could be flogged publicly for offenses that today seem astonishingly minor. Appeals were almost non-existent. Punishments varied from captain to captain, and ordinary seamen had virtually no influence over the laws governing their own lives. Pirates, men officially branded enemies of civilization, approached the same problem differently. Before many pirate ships ever sailed under a black flag, every crew member gathered to approve a written set of rules. These articles were not symbolic promises or vague codes of honor. They explained how treasure would be divided, who held authority during battle, how disputes would be settled, what happened when someone stole from the crew, and exactly which punishments applied to each offense. Every sailor accepted those terms before a single cannon was fired. Imagine joining a criminal enterprise that required you to sign a contract before committing your first crime. It sounds almost absurd, yet surviving documents suggest that was exactly how many pirate crews operated during the Golden Age of Piracy. That does not mean pirates were kind. They were capable of extraordinary violence, and many deserved the fear attached to their names. Ships were seized, prisoners were tortured, and innocent lives were destroyed in pursuit of profit. None of that disappears simply because some pirate crews followed written procedures aboard their own vessels. But brutality and organization are not opposites. History is full of violent societies that relied on carefully designed systems to survive. Pirate crews faced a unique problem. Hundreds of miles from land, surrounded by armed men, carrying enormous wealth, and hunted by every major naval power, they could not afford constant internal conflict. One mutiny, one dishonest quartermaster, or one captain abusing his authority could destroy everyone aboard long before the Royal Navy ever appeared on the horizon. They needed rules. More importantly, they needed rules everyone believed were legitimate. Without courts, governments, or police to enforce order, the only authority that truly mattered was the authority accepted by the crew itself. That necessity transformed pirate ships into something few people expect. Not democracies in the modern sense, not utopias, but floating societies built on negotiated power rather than unquestioned command. That single difference changes almost every popular myth surrounding piracy. The captain was not always the most powerful man aboard. The quartermaster could overrule him in many day-to-day matters. Treasure was rarely distributed according to rank alone. Compensation existed for serious injuries. Major decisions were often voted upon. Even punishment, something most people imagine as immediate and arbitrary, frequently followed procedures agreed upon long before the offense occurred. The deeper historians have examined surviving pirate articles over the last century, the clearer one fact has become. Pirates were far less chaotic than their reputation suggests. Ironically, much of that reputation came from the people determined to destroy them. Colonial governors needed public support to finance anti-piracy campaigns. Naval officers justified increasingly aggressive crackdowns by portraying pirates as monsters beyond reason. Newspapers eagerly printed sensational stories because horror sold copies then just as effectively as it generates clicks today. Every exaggerated tale reinforced the same simple message. Pirates were animals. Animals do not negotiate. Animals do not write constitutions. Animals certainly do not hold votes. The truth was considerably less convenient. Several independent sources, including surviving articles of agreement, Admiralty trial records, and contemporary accounts, describe remarkably similar systems appearing aboard completely different pirate ships commanded by different captains across different oceans. While individual rules varied, the underlying principles remained surprisingly consistent. Authority was divided. Responsibilities were defined. Punishments were written in advance. Leadership depended, at least in part, on continued support from the crew. That consistency is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. It suggests that pirate governance was not invented by one unusually enlightened captain. It evolved because it solved problems. Every successful pirate crew faced the same reality. They could not replace experienced sailors easily. They could not call for reinforcements. They could not rely on governments to resolve disputes. Internal stability was not a philosophical luxury. It was a matter of survival. Lose discipline, and the ship died. Lose trust, and the crew fractured. Lose fairness, and someone eventually reached for a pistol. Understanding that changes the entire story before we even examine a single punishment. Because once you realize pirate justice existed to protect the crew as much as to control it, a much larger question appears. If criminals operating outside the law invested so much effort creating rules for themselves, what did justice actually look like aboard the ships enforcing the law? That answer is far more uncomfortable than most people expect. Before we can compare those two worlds, however, we need to understand where pirate law came from in the first place. It did not emerge from nowhere, and it certainly did not begin beneath a black flag. Its roots reach back through merchant fleets, naval service, medieval maritime customs, and generations of sailors who learned, often through suffering, exactly what happens when absolute power is placed in the hands of a single man at sea. That is where the real story begins. A man stood on the deck of his own ship, with his wrists tied behind his back, while 12 men who had fought beside him for years prepared to decide whether he would leave that deck alive. There was no royal courtroom waiting beyond the horizon, no judge appointed by a king, no officer of the Royal Navy reading charges beneath the authority of the crown. Every face looking back at him belonged to another pirate. Every man holding a vote had once signed the very same document that now determined his fate. It is an image that feels almost impossible because nearly everything popular culture has taught us about pirates suggests the opposite. We imagine screaming captains, drunken violence, blades drawn over the smallest insult, and executions ordered on a whim. We picture chaos wearing a black flag. Yet the surviving evidence paints a far stranger and far more uncomfortable picture. The most feared outlaws of the Golden Age did not survive because they rejected rules. They survived because they created their own. Before a pirate ship ever hunted its first prize, many crews gathered together to write a detailed agreement explaining exactly how life aboard that vessel would work. It described how treasure would be divided, who held authority in battle, how disagreements would be settled, what happened when someone stole from the company, and which punishments applied to every serious offense. Every sailor placed his name or his mark beneath those articles before sharing a single piece of stolen gold. That single fact alone overturns one of history's oldest myths. The world's most infamous criminals were often governed by written laws they had chosen for themselves. The contradiction becomes even more remarkable when you compare those laws with the legal system hunting them across the Atlantic. While the Royal Navy presented itself as the defender of civilization, its ordinary sailors frequently lived beneath a system where captains exercised enormous personal authority. Punishments could be severe, appeals were rare, and the men expected to obey had almost no influence over the rules controlling their lives. Pirate crews approached the same problem from a completely different direction. They understood something every group of armed men trapped together at sea eventually discovers. A ship cannot survive long if fear is the only thing holding it together. Months away from land, carrying treasure worth fortunes, hunted by naval squadrons, surrounded by loaded muskets and sharpened cutlasses, they depended upon one another every hour of every day. A dishonest captain could destroy an entire voyage. A corrupt quartermaster could divide the crew. An argument left unresolved could become a mutiny before sunrise. Order was not a luxury, it was survival. That necessity forced pirates to build something nobody expects to find beneath a black flag. Not democracy as we understand it today, and certainly not a peaceful society, but a system where authority depended upon agreement rather than unquestioned obedience. That does not make pirates heroes. They robbed merchant ships, attacked coastal settlements, kidnapped prisoners, and left devastation across the Atlantic and the Caribbean. Violence remained central to their lives, and many of their punishments were brutal by any standard. Marooning could become a slow death. Mutilation was real. Execution remained a possibility for the gravest offenses. But brutality alone does not explain how pirate society actually functioned. Throughout history, some of the most violent organizations have also been among the most organized. Empires, armies, criminal syndicates, and revolutionary movements all discovered the same lesson. Lasting power depends upon predictable rules. Pirates learned it faster than most because the consequences of failure appeared immediately. If discipline collapsed aboard a ship hundreds of miles from land, there was no government waiting to restore order. There were no courts, no police, and no outside authority capable of saving anyone aboard. The crew itself became the law because nothing else existed. That reality explains why historians studying surviving pirate articles have repeatedly reached the same surprising conclusion. Pirate justice was rarely random. It followed procedures. Leadership carried limits. Decisions often required approval from the crew. The captain did not always possess unlimited authority, and in many everyday matters, another officer held just as much influence. The quartermaster represented the interests of the ordinary sailors, supervised the division of captured wealth, settled disputes, and acted as a powerful balance against the captain himself. That division of authority did not appear by accident. Most pirates had previously served aboard merchant ships or naval vessels, where they experienced exactly what happened when absolute power belonged to one man. Many deserted those ships precisely because of harsh discipline, poor treatment, unpaid wages, or abusive officers. They carried those memories with them when they became outlaws. Ironically, some of the men condemned as enemies of civilization built systems specifically designed to prevent the abuses they had suffered under legal governments. So why does almost nobody know this story today? The answer lies partly in who recorded history. Colonial officials, naval officers, newspaper publishers, and governments all benefited from portraying pirates as savage monsters incapable of reason. The more terrifying pirates appeared, the easier it became to justify expensive naval campaigns, public executions, and increasingly aggressive anti-piracy laws. Sensational stories spread faster than careful descriptions of written agreements and crew elections. A captain ordering a man to walk the plank sold newspapers. A crew debating punishment through a vote did not. Over time, the myths became stronger than the documents themselves. Yet surviving pirate articles, Admiralty court records, and contemporary accounts preserved enough evidence to reveal a far more complicated reality. Across different oceans, different captains, and different decades, remarkably similar systems continued to appear. Written rules, shared authority, agreed punishments, crew votes. Those patterns are too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. They suggest that pirate law developed because it solved practical problems that every successful crew eventually faced. Understanding that changes everything about the story we think we know. Because once you accept that criminals operating beyond the reach of every government deliberately created legal systems to restrain their own leaders, an even more uncomfortable question immediately follows. If pirates believed power required limits, what did justice actually look like aboard the ships flying the king's flag? The answer begins long before the first black flag ever appeared on the horizon, because pirate law did not emerge from nowhere. It grew from centuries of maritime tradition, hard experience, and one simple lesson learned by generations of sailors who understood better than anyone what happened when authority answered to nobody at all. A pirate ship was one of the last places on Earth where anyone expected to find fairness. Everything about its reputation suggested the opposite. These were floating fortresses, commanded by wanted criminals, hunted by empires, and crewed by men who had willingly abandoned the protection of every government in the Atlantic world. By all logic, such a place should have been ruled by fear alone. Yet the further historians looked into the surviving evidence, the more that assumption began to collapse. The foundations of pirate law were not built after these men became pirates. They were built years earlier, while many of them still served aboard merchant vessels and warships under perfectly legal flags. Long before they ever raised the Jolly Roger, they had already learned one lesson that would shape everything they created afterward. Absolute authority at sea was often more dangerous than the storms themselves. Life aboard a merchant ship during the late 17th and early 18th centuries could be unimaginably harsh. Food spoiled quickly. Fresh water became foul after weeks in wooden barrels. Disease spread through cramped decks with terrifying speed. Sailors worked exhausting shifts in every kind of weather, climbed towering masts during violent storms, and faced punishment for mistakes that sometimes amounted to little more than bad luck. Captains possessed enormous authority over nearly every aspect of daily life. Wages were frequently delayed or withheld altogether. Discipline could be arbitrary, and complaints rarely traveled further than the officer responsible for causing them. For thousands of ordinary seamen, the sea became a place where the law protected rank far more reliably than it protected the men doing the work. The Royal Navy offered greater prestige, but often demanded even greater sacrifice. Britain depended upon its navy to defend trade routes, expand imperial power, and fight wars across the globe. Maintaining such a fleet required enormous numbers of experienced sailors, and voluntary recruitment rarely supplied enough men. Press gangs roamed ports, boarded merchant ships, and forced countless sailors into naval service, whether they wished to serve or not. Overnight, a merchant seaman could find himself wearing the king's uniform without ever volunteering to do so. Once aboard, he entered a world governed by strict hierarchy, relentless discipline, and legal codes he had never agreed to write or approve. Many future pirates experienced that system firsthand. They watched officers reward favorites, witnessed punishments carried out in front of entire crews, and learned what happened when one individual possessed nearly unlimited authority over dozens or even hundreds of armed men trapped together on a wooden vessel far from land. Those experiences stayed with them. When some eventually deserted, mutinied, or embraced piracy, they did not simply reject the governments pursuing them. They also rejected the structure of power they believed had failed them. Ironically, many of history's most notorious outlaws borrowed ideas from legitimate maritime traditions that had existed long before piracy reached its golden age. Medieval European sailors already understood that life at sea demanded clear agreements. One of the earliest surviving examples appeared in the Rolls of Oleron, a collection of maritime customs developed centuries before Blackbeard or Bartholomew Roberts ever sailed. Those rules addressed practical questions involving wages, discipline, damaged cargo, responsibility aboard ship, and the fair resolution of disputes. Over generations, merchant sailors became accustomed to the idea that dangerous voyages required predictable expectations shared by everyone involved. Buccaneers operating throughout the Caribbean during the 17th century expanded those traditions even further. Before launching attacks against Spanish settlements, many agreed in advance how captured wealth would be divided and what compensation injured men would receive. A sailor who lost an arm, a leg, or an eye during battle did not simply disappear into poverty if the expedition succeeded. Payments were often specified before the first musket fired. These arrangements were not acts of generosity, they were practical solutions. Men fought harder when they knew their sacrifices would not leave their families destitute. By the early 1700s, these scattered customs had evolved into something far more sophisticated aboard many pirate vessels. Before leaving port under a newly elected captain, crews frequently gathered to draft articles of agreement. Every member accepted the document before joining the voyage. Some signed their names. Others, unable to write, placed a simple mark beside the articles. Surviving accounts even describe one crew swearing its oath upon a hatchet because no Bible happened to be available. The symbolism hardly mattered. What mattered was mutual consent. Everyone aboard understood the rules before anyone had the chance to break them. Those articles covered astonishing detail. They explained how captured treasure would be divided, established compensation for injuries, prohibited theft from fellow crew members, required weapons to remain clean and battle-ready, regulated gambling, assigned responsibilities during combat, and specified punishments for offenses ranging from drunken negligence to desertion. Nothing about them resembled random violence. They resembled contracts. Perhaps the greatest surprise involved the captain himself. Popular culture portrays pirate captains as tyrants, whose word alone determined life and death. Historical evidence suggests something much more complicated. During battle, captains possessed broad authority because hesitation could sink a ship. Outside combat, however, many everyday decisions belonged to the quartermaster, an officer elected specifically to represent the crew's interests. He supervised the division of plunder, resolved disputes, distributed supplies, and acted as an institutional counterweight against excessive authority. If a captain abused his position, demonstrated cowardice, or consistently lost the crew's confidence, he could be removed through a vote. That possibility fundamentally changed the balance of power aboard many pirate ships. Leadership depended not only upon fear, but also upon continued trust. Historians should be cautious here, because only a limited number of complete pirate codes survive today, and not every pirate crew followed identical practices. Yet the remarkable consistency among independent sources strongly suggests these principles were widespread rather than exceptional. Different captains operating across different oceans repeatedly adopted similar ideas about shared authority, written agreements, and defined punishments. That pattern raises an extraordinary question. If pirate crews invested so much effort building systems designed to limit power before anyone committed a crime, what happened when someone finally broke those rules? That is where the surviving articles become truly fascinating, because the punishments themselves reveal a legal culture far more organized than the legends would ever allow. The single best surviving example of a pirate legal code belongs to Bartholomew Roberts, better known as Black Bart, the Welsh pirate who captured more ships than any other captain of the Golden Age. His articles of agreement survived because they were recorded in A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, only 2 years after Roberts was killed off the coast of West Africa. While historians continue to debate portions of that book, the remarkable consistency between Roberts' Code, Admiralty court records, and other surviving pirate articles leaves little doubt that many pirate crews operated under surprisingly similar systems. What those documents reveal is not a floating dictatorship ruled by fear, but an organized society where expectations were established long before anyone broke the rules. The very first article in Roberts' Code did not concern violence, loyalty, or obedience. It declared that every member of the company possessed an equal vote in matters of importance and an equal claim to provisions captured during their voyages, unless shortages required rationing for the good of everyone aboard. Even then, rationing itself became a collective decision rather than the whim of a single captain. It is a remarkable place to begin a criminal constitution. Equality came before punishment. Cooperation came before authority. The remaining articles continued the same philosophy. Gambling for money was forbidden because unpaid debts created resentment among men who depended on one another to survive. Every sailor had a responsibility to keep his pistols, cutlass, and powder ready for battle at all times because one neglected weapon endangered the entire crew rather than just its owner. Lights were extinguished at a fixed hour each evening to reduce the constant risk of fire aboard a wooden ship packed with gunpowder, tar, rope, and dry timber. Men wishing to continue drinking after that time were expected to remain on deck rather than disturb those trying to sleep below. Even the ship's musicians, whose duties included lifting morale during endless weeks at sea, received guaranteed rest on the Sabbath, except during emergencies. None of these rules resemble the reckless anarchy pirates have come to symbolize. They resemble the practical regulations of a small community struggling to survive in one of the harshest environments imaginable. When someone violated those agreements, punishment rarely began with immediate violence. Instead, the accusation itself became a matter for the company. The accused stood before the assembled crew, witnesses spoke when available, and discussion took place openly before any decision was reached. Once the facts had been considered, the crew voted not only on guilt, but often on the appropriate punishment as well. That process mattered because everyone present had already accepted the articles governing the case. The law did not appear after the crime, it existed before the temptation. Some offenses threatened individual sailors, others threatened every life aboard the ship, and pirate punishments reflected that distinction. Theft from the common stock ranked among the gravest crimes because every captured coin belonged to the entire company until officially divided. A man caught secretly stealing gold, silver, jewels, or valuable cargo from communal plunder could face marooning, one of the harshest punishments found throughout surviving pirate articles. Captain John Phillips described the sentence in chilling detail. The guilty man was left alone on an isolated shore with a firearm, a limited amount of powder, a bottle of water, and little hope of rescue. Technically, he had not been executed. In reality, survival depended almost entirely upon impossible luck. Yet even this punishment followed written rules agreed upon before anyone attempted theft. Personal disputes followed different procedures. Robert's Code specifically prohibited fighting aboard ship because violence in such confined quarters endangered everyone nearby. Instead of settling arguments immediately, opponents waited until reaching land, where the quartermaster supervised an organized duel using swords or pistols under agreed conditions. The objective was not to encourage violence, but to remove it from the crowded deck, where stray shots or reckless blades could kill innocent crewmen. Even discipline reflected planning rather than impulse. Several pirate articles prescribed 40 lashes save one for certain offenses, borrowing an older legal tradition intended to place an upper limit on corporal punishment rather than allowing it to escalate endlessly. One of the most surprising provisions involved injury. Pirate crews understood that battle inevitably left some men permanently disabled. Rather than abandoning them once they became unable to fight, many articles established predetermined compensation from the common treasury. Roberts promised 800 pieces of eight for the loss of a limb, with smaller payments assigned to less severe injuries. By modern standards, these sums could never erase the suffering involved. But for the early 18th century, they represented something astonishingly close to an insurance system, funded collectively by the crew. Every pirate knew the risks before battle began, and every pirate knew exactly what support awaited him if he survived wounded. Perhaps the greatest myth destroyed by these documents concerns the punishment everyone associates with pirates. Walking the plank has become one of the most recognizable images in popular culture, appearing in novels, films, cartoons, and theme parks across the world. Yet historians have searched surviving pirate articles, Admiralty court proceedings, eyewitness testimonies, and contemporary records without finding evidence that it served as a common punishment during the Golden Age. Isolated incidents may have occurred later, but the famous ritual itself belongs far more to 19th century fiction than 18th century piracy. The real punishments were cruel enough without inventing new ones. Marooning, mutilation, whipping, and execution required no embellishment. The crucial difference is that they existed inside systems whose rules were known in advance. That uncomfortable reality forces one final comparison. If history's most notorious criminals often relied upon written laws, elected officers, and agreed procedures before punishing their own, what kind of justice awaited ordinary sailors serving aboard the ships of the British Empire? That comparison changes the story completely. Here is where the story takes its most unexpected turn. Everything we have looked at so far concerns men officially branded as criminals by every major empire of their age. Their punishments could be ruthless, their lives violent, and their profession depended upon robbery. Yet when we compare their legal system with the one operating aboard His Majesty's ships, the line separating outlaw from law-abiding authority suddenly becomes far less clear than history usually suggests. The Royal Navy possessed the full power of the British Empire behind it. It sailed under the protection of Parliament, answered to the Admiralty, and claimed to represent law, order, and civilization across the world's oceans. Pirates possessed none of those advantages. They had no government, no courts willing to defend them, no official recognition, and no place to appeal if they believed justice had failed. By every reasonable expectation, the Navy should have offered greater protection to the ordinary sailor. In many cases, it did exactly the opposite. The legal foundation of naval discipline rested upon the Articles of War, a comprehensive code governing everything from mutiny and cowardice to theft and desertion. On paper, it appeared systematic and orderly. In practice, however, the ordinary sailor exercised almost no influence over those laws. He had not voted for them. He had not signed them voluntarily. Many had never even chosen to join the service in the first place. Throughout the 18th century, British press gangs regularly seized experienced seamen from merchant vessels and coastal towns, forcing them into naval service whether they consented or not. Overnight, a civilian sailor could become a servant of the crown under laws he had never agreed to obey. Once aboard, his fate depended almost entirely upon officers appointed above him rather than chosen beside him. Captains held extraordinary authority over discipline. For many routine offenses, they could order corporal punishment without consulting the crew, without any meaningful vote, and with little opportunity for the accused to challenge the decision. Floggings carried out with the infamous cat-o'-nine-tails became one of the defining images of naval discipline. They were performed publicly, partly to punish the offender, and partly to remind everyone else aboard exactly who held power. More serious accusations proceeded before courts-martial, yet even these differed dramatically from the procedures found aboard many pirate ships. The judges were officers, the laws originated from Parliament, the accused possessed no equal vote, no elected representative, and no meaningful role in shaping the system deciding his future. Punishments could be devastating. Desertion frequently resulted in hundreds of lashes. Mutiny carried the possibility of execution. Certain crimes required death under the Articles of War, regardless of surrounding circumstances, leaving courts with almost no discretion even when they believed mercy was deserved. One of the most famous examples involved Admiral John Byng in 1757. After failing to relieve the British garrison on Minorca during war with France, Byng faced court-martial under a law requiring execution for officers who failed to do their utmost in battle. The court itself recommended clemency, believing the punishment excessive. Parliament offered none. Byng was executed by firing squad, despite widespread recognition that the law left little room for justice once guilt had been established. If a decorated admiral could not escape the machinery of the legal system he served, an ordinary pressed sailor possessed even less hope. Beneath official punishment existed another layer of discipline, far less visible but equally revealing. Petty officers routinely drove exhausted sailors harder through beatings delivered on the spot, using ropes, sticks, or canes, a practice commonly known as starting. These blows often occurred without formal accusation, recorded sentence, or legal hearing of any kind. They existed because immediate obedience mattered more than procedural fairness. Although officially discouraged and eventually prohibited, historians note that the practice persisted long after reforms appeared on paper. Compare that reality with the pirate codes we examined earlier. A pirate accused of theft faced rules written before the crime occurred. A pirate captain could not always punish men unilaterally outside battle. The quartermaster represented the crew's interests. Leadership itself depended upon continued confidence from those being led. None of this transformed pirate ships into enlightened societies. They remained violent criminal enterprises. But the contrast exposes something profoundly uncomfortable. The Empire, describing pirates as lawless, often granted fewer procedural protections to its own sailors than many pirate crews granted one another. The difference was not kindness, it was accountability. A pirate captain ruled only so long as armed men willingly accepted his authority. A naval captain ruled because the crown empowered him to do so. One system depended upon consent, the other depended upon command. That distinction shaped everything from leadership to punishment. History has spent centuries telling us that civilization defeated chaos on the high seas. The surviving documents suggest a far more complicated reality. Sometimes, the men sailing beneath the black flag demanded limits on power that the empire hunting them never required of itself. And once you recognize that contradiction, the final question becomes impossible to ignore. If history remembered one side as monsters and the other as guardians of law, how much of that story was shaped by evidence, and how much was written by the victors themselves? Step back from the punishments themselves for a moment and look at what really separated these two worlds. It was not violence. Both pirate ships and naval vessels could be brutally unforgiving places where a single mistake ruined lives forever. The real difference was something far less obvious. It was consent. Pirate crews built their authority from the bottom up because they had no government standing behind them. Every agreement, every article, every vote existed for one reason alone. If the crew stopped believing the system was fair, the system collapsed. There were no reinforcements coming over the horizon, no courts waiting in the next port, and no empire powerful enough to force obedience. A pirate captain commanded only as long as armed men willingly accepted his leadership. Lose that trust, and he could lose his ship. The Royal Navy operated under the exact opposite principle. Its authority flowed from the top down. Parliament wrote the laws. The Admiralty enforced them. Captains represented the crown, not the consent of the sailors serving beneath them. Whether a man approved of the system or despised it mattered very little, because the system possessed the power to replace him almost immediately. Thousands of desperate seamen could always be recruited or impressed to fill the empty space he left behind. When institutions no longer depend upon the cooperation of the people beneath them, accountability becomes far easier to ignore. That uncomfortable reality reaches far beyond the age of piracy. Throughout history, organizations built upon voluntary cooperation have often developed surprisingly sophisticated systems for limiting power, because they cannot survive without mutual trust. Organizations backed by overwhelming authority rarely face the same pressure. They already possess obedience. They no longer need to earn it. That does not mean pirate society was morally superior, nor does it excuse the crimes committed beneath the black flag. Pirates robbed merchant vessels, destroyed livelihoods, kidnapped prisoners, and killed countless innocent people. Many died exactly as the law demanded, hanging from gallows built to warn others against following the same path. Nothing in the surviving evidence changes those facts. But history becomes dangerous when it replaces complexity with comfortable myths. For generations, pirates have been remembered as symbols of absolute lawlessness, while governments have been remembered as symbols of justice and civilization. The historical record tells a more complicated story. The same pirate crews capable of terrifying violence also created written constitutions, elected officers, compensated wounded sailors, divided wealth according to agreed formulas, and required leaders to answer to the people following them. The same governments that condemned those criminals sometimes subjected their own sailors to systems offering fewer procedural protections than the outlaws they pursued. That contradiction does not erase the brutality of piracy. It reveals the brutality that could exist within legal authority as well. Perhaps that is why this story remained buried for so long. Most surviving accounts of piracy came from the people determined to eliminate it. Admiralty prosecutors, colonial governors, naval officers, and newspaper publishers all had understandable reasons to emphasize cruelty while ignoring organization. A pirate governed by written law complicated the simple narrative of civilized empire defeating savage criminals. A pirate crew holding elections before dividing treasure made for poor propaganda. A captain removed by vote sounded dangerously similar to ideas spreading elsewhere in the 18th century Atlantic world. It was far easier to remember pirates as monsters than as human beings capable of building functioning institutions under extraordinary circumstances. Yet the surviving articles of agreement refused to disappear. Court records preserved them. Witnesses described them. Different crews, separated by thousands of miles, continued to follow remarkably similar principles, despite never serving under the same captain. Piece by piece, the documents survived long enough for modern historians to compare legend with evidence. And when those comparisons were finally made, one conclusion emerged again and again. Pirate ships were never the chaotic free-for-all popular culture promised. They were disciplined communities, held together by rules their own members believed were necessary. In the end, perhaps the greatest myth was never the treasure maps, the parrots, or even the plank. Perhaps the greatest myth was believing that legality and justice have always been the same thing. One represents power recognized by governments. The other depends upon how power is actually used. Sometimes those ideas stand together. Sometimes they drift very far apart. 3 centuries ago, beneath black flags flying over the Atlantic, a handful of outlaws accidentally exposed that difference in ways history spent generations trying to forget. The next time you hear someone describe pirates as men who rejected every law ever written, remember the bound captain standing silently on the deck while 12 ordinary sailors prepared to cast their votes. Before they decided whether he would live or die, they first opened the document they had all agreed to obey. That single moment tells us more about pirate justice than any Hollywood legend ever could.